Don't you dare ask us to cancel our plans again. We've had these Elton John tickets for months. My mother's voice exploded through the hospital room, sharp and uncaring. I sat there, stunned, gripping my phone with trembling hands. The pain in my abdomen was unbearable, like a knife twisting deep inside me, but somehow, the look on her face hurt even more. It was Christmas Eve, and I was alone in Las Vegas Medical Center. Well, not entirely alone. My 2-year-old twins, Leo and Ava, played quietly in the corner, unaware of the nightmare unfolding. A nurse, Rachel, was at my bedside, checking my vitals, her expression tight with concern. I swallowed hard, trying to process what had just happened. My parents, my own flesh and blood, had refused to help. They didn't care that I was being prepped for emergency surgery. They didn't care that I had internal bleeding that could cost me my life. All they cared about was their concert tickets. And celebrating Christmas Eve with my younger sister Jessica. I had no one else left to call. No one. When I begged them, when I was out of options, my dad's response cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. You're becoming a real nuisance and a burden, Lauren. We're retired now. We deserve to enjoy our lives without your constant problems. A burden. That's what I was to them. Not their daughter, not a grieving widow, not the mother of their only grandchildren, just a nuisance. And to make it worse, I had been supporting them financially for years. Every single month, without fail, I sent them $2,500 to help with their mortgage, their bills, their comfortable little retirement. Even after Daniel died, my husband, my rock, my safe place. And yet, here I was, alone. Tears slid silently down my face, soaking into the hospital blanket. Rachel hesitated for a moment before gently squeezing my shoulder. My friend Sophie is a professional nanny, she said softly. She specializes in childhood trauma. Let me call her for you. Her kindness was a stark contrast to my parents' cruelty. I glanced at Leo and Ava, so small, so innocent. They had already lost their father in that awful too? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. But one thing was even worse, the idea of leaving them in the care of people who saw them as burdens. No, never. I forced myself to yes, I please call her. And with those words, I made my decision. This wasn't just about surgery. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about cutting ties. For as I hung up the phone, a flood of memories rushed in, bitter and undeniable. I had always been the afterthought. Jessica was the golden child. When I graduated college with honors, my parents barely noticed, because Jessica had been cast in a local commercial the same weekend. When I got married to Daniel, they complained about the wedding venue being too far from their house. When I gave birth to my twins, they visited once, and left early because they thought the babies were too fussy. Through all of it, Daniel had been there, holding my hand. We'll build our own family, he used to say, one that knows how to love. And we had. Our home was filled with laughter, warmth, acceptance, until a drunk driver ripped him away from us. After that, the grief nearly swallowed me whole, but I still got up, I still paid my parents' bills. I even sent them more money when they claimed they were struggling with inflation. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was proving that family stands by each other, even when it hurts. But all I was proving was that they never cared about me in the first place. And that was about to change, for good. The irony was unbearable. I was bleeding internally, possibly dying, and my parents couldn't miss one concert to watch their own grandchildren. Rachel returned, her voice gentle but firm. Sophie's on her way, she'll be here within the hour. I exhaled, tension easing just a fraction. She's okay with short notice? She's amazing with kids, Rachel assured me. She used to work with trauma victims at the children's hospital before becoming a private nanny. A professional, someone who actually cared. A pang of guilt twisted in my chest. How much is this going to cost? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Medical bills were already piling up, thanks to the limitations on James's insurance. Rachel shook her head. Don't worry about that now. Let's focus on getting you through surgery. But I was worried. I thought about the $2,500 I was scheduled to send to my parents next week. Money that, up until this moment, I had sent without hesitation, believing I owed them, that it was my responsibility. But now? Now that money could actually go towards something important, something that mattered. The thought sparked something inside me, a small, defiant flame of self-preservation, a flame that had been extinguished years ago. When Sophie arrived, she was everything Rachel had promised, kind, professional, and instantly connecting with the twins. Leo, usually shy around strangers, reached for her hand without hesitation. Ava clung to her leg, trusting her within minutes. That told me everything I needed to know. As hospital staff prepped me for surgery, a decision crystallized in my mind. I turned to Valerie, one of the nurses. "Could you bring me my phone one more time?" With shaking hands, I sent 2 messages. The first, to my bank, cancel all future automatic transfers to my parents' account. The second, to my parents, I will no longer be providing financial support. My children and I deserve better than being your afterthoughts. Don't contact me again. I hit send. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, something unexpected washed over me, through the fear, through the pain. Freedom. The surgery was successful, but the recovery was brutal. 5 days in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, too weak to move. Through it all, Sophie stayed with the twins. During the day, she sat by my bedside, keeping Leo and Ava entertained. At night, she took them back to my apartment, making sure they felt safe. I owed her more than I could ever say. On my 3rd day awake, I finally noticed my phone blinking on the nightstand. 27 missed calls. Dozens of unread messages. I didn't even need to look to know who they were from. My parents? Jessica. The messages followed a predictable pattern. First, confusion, then, anger. Then, the inevitable desperate pleas because their mortgage payment was due. Not once did they ask how my surgery went. Not once did they ask if the twins were okay. But my dad's final message? That was the one that made me laugh out loud. "You can't just cut us off like this. We've planned a cruise next month, and the tickets are non-refundable." A cruise. While I was fighting for my life, they were worried about a vacation. Jessica's messages, however, were different. She seemed genuinely confused. "Mom and Dad just told me you were having some minor procedure. What's going on? Why are they freaking out about money?" I stared at the screen, realization dawning. They lied to her. Of course they did. They couldn't tell her the truth, that they chose a concert over their daughter's emergency surgery, that they let 2 toddlers sit in a hospital room alone because they didn't want to be inconvenienced. Still groggy from the medication, I sent Jessica a long message telling her everything. Her response came instantly. "Oh my God, Lauren, I had no idea it was emergency surgery. They told me you were just being dramatic about a routine checkup. I would have watched the twins if I'd known. I'm so sorry." And I believed her. Jessica wasn't cruel. She had just been raised in an environment where she was taught her needs came first. Maybe this would be her double wake-up call. Maybe this would be what finally made her see our parents for who they truly were. By the time I was discharged, I had made 3 decisions. First, I hired Sophie part-time to help with the twins during my recovery. Second, I contacted a lawyer to draft a will, making sure that if anything happened to me, my twins would never end up in my parents' care. Third, I blocked my parents' numbers, completely. As for Jessica, I kept the door slightly open, but only on my terms, because from now on, I was choosing my family. And my parents? They were no longer part of it. Cutting them off financially changed everything. That $2,500 a month, nearly a third of my income, was no longer vanishing into a bottomless pit of entitlement. For the first time in years, I could actually afford proper childcare. I could start rebuilding my emergency fund, the one that had been drained after James died. That night, lying in my own bed, the twins asleep in their room across the hall, a flood of emotions washed over me. Guilt. That deeply ingrained, conditioned feeling that I was wrong for putting my children and myself first. Fear. Could I really handle recovery and 2 toddlers at the same time? But underneath it all, something new was taking root. Self-respect. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying people who refused to carry themselves. Then my phone pinged. "Jessica. I just had a huge fight with Mom and Dad about how they treated you. I'm staying at a hotel tonight. Can we talk tomorrow?" I stared at the screen. Maybe I wasn't completely alone after all. 2 weeks after surgery, I was slowly regaining my strength. The incision still throbbed painfully if I moved too fast, but each day, I was getting better. Sophie was a lifesaver, arriving every morning, helping with the twins, making sure I could still get some work done. My clients, thankfully, had been understanding about my limited availability. Remote work was keeping me afloat, allowing me to stay close to my kids. And then, there was Jessica. She had visited twice, brought healthy meals, spent time with the twins. At first, our conversations were cautious, like two people walking across thin ice, afraid of saying the wrong thing. But one night, as we sat watching the twins play, she let her guard down. "They always made it seem like you were choosing to distance yourself from the family," she admitted, voice quiet. "I never realized they were the ones pushing you away." I let that sink in. For years, I had been the black sheep, the ungrateful daughter, who just didn't try hard enough. But now, she was finally seeing the truth. I wasn't ready to fully trust her. Not yet. But for the first time in our lives, I felt like she was trying. Then came the knock at the door, the one I had been half expecting. My stomach tightened as I looked through the peephole. There they were. My mother, clutching her designer purse, nervously adjusting the strap. My father, standing stiff, arms crossed, his usual impatience etched into every hard line on his face. I hesitated. My heart pounded in my chest. Then slowly I opened the door just enough to speak. "What do you want?" My voice was steadier than I expected. "Natasha, darling," my mother began, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. And just like that, my defenses snapped into place. "You haven't answered our calls," she continued. "And we needed to make sure you and the twins were all right." "We're fine." The words came out flat, empty, final. "Now, if that's all," "It's not all," my father cut in, shoving slightly against the door. The heat in my chest flared. "We need to discuss this ridiculous financial situation," he said, his tone shifting from concern to accusation in an instant. Of course. The bank had called, their mortgage payment was due, and, oh no, they had to dip into their cruise savings to cover it. I blinked. They weren't here because they cared. They weren't here because they had realized their mistake. They were here because they wanted their money back. I clenched my jaw. "I told you, I'm cutting financial ties." I met his glare, voice cold. "I meant it." My mother's expression twisted. "But sweetie," she pleaded, her voice rising an octave, "we've come to depend on that money. Your father and I adjusted our lifestyle based on your commitment to help us." I stared at her, barely believing what I was hearing. My commitment? My heart pounded. I had been sending them money out of guilt, out of some warped sense of duty. And they had the audacity to act like it was my job? I exhaled slowly, my voice like steel. "I've been paying you out of obligation, and while I was in the hospital fighting for my life, you couldn't even watch your own grandchildren." A flicker of irritation crossed my father's face. "That's not fair, Natasha." Oh, he did not just say that. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing him to look me in the eye. "Not fair?" I repeated. "You had plans. Plans more important than my children's safety. More important than my life." I swallowed, anger building. "Do you know what the doctor said?" Silence. "There was a chance I might not survive that surgery. Did you even bother to ask?" Silence, and that was answer enough. My mother let out a dramatic sigh, shaking her head. "We made one mistake," she whispered, like she was the real victim here. "Are you really going to punish us like this?" I exhaled slowly, a strange calm settling over me. "This isn't punishment, Mom. This is a consequence." She blinked. "I spent my entire life seeking your approval, your support, and in my moment of greatest need, you chose Elton John tickets over your own daughter." I let the words sit there, let them feel the weight of what they had done. My father crossed his arms, his voice shifting to commanding. "We're your parents." "And I'm a parent too," I countered, my voice steady. "I would never treat Leo and Ava the way you've treated me. Never." As if on cue, Ava toddled into the hallway, clutching her stuffed giraffe. And just like that, my mother switched tactics. "There's my precious grandbaby," she cooed, bending down, arms outstretched. "Grandma brought presents." Ava hesitated, taking a small step back, her tiny face unsure. My stomach twisted. They were strangers to her. I took a slow breath. "I think you should leave." My mother's head snapped up. "Or what?" "When I'm ready to talk, if I'm ever ready, I'll reach out." I turned to close the door. "But the money," my father started, "is no longer your concern," I finished. And with that, I shut the door. The next morning they came back. But this time, they brought reinforcements. My Aunt Patty, my mother's sister, the self-proclaimed family peacemaker. Her voice was soft, almost pleading as she called through the door. "Natasha, honey, let's be reasonable. Your parents are struggling without your help." I took a deep breath and stayed firm. "They managed their finances for decades before I started helping them," I replied. They chose early retirement, knowing full well they didn't have enough saved. A brief pause, then my mother's voice broke in. We made those decisions because you promised to help us. My jaw clenched. We've had to cancel our cruise, she added, her voice cracking. And now we might lose the house. There it was. Their words were like a mirror, reflecting just how blind I had been all these years. They weren't struggling, they weren't helpless, they were entitled. I'd offered to help temporarily after their retirement, but somewhere along the way, that had morphed into a lifetime expectation, one they thought I was obligated to fulfill. I exhaled sharply. Mom, Dad, I just had major surgery. I'm caring for 2 toddlers. This conversation, it's over. And I walked away. They kept knocking, kept pleading. I didn't turn back. Later that day, I got the email, a group email, from my father, to the entire extended family. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, painting me as the ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her parents after they had sacrificed everything for me. Of course, there was no mention of their refusal to help with the twins, no mention of the concert tickets they prioritized over my life, just a carefully crafted guilt trip for an audience. But what they hadn't expected was the backlash. My cousin Michael, who lived near my parents, was the first to respond. Uncle Robert, didn't you just buy a new boat last month? And then another reply. And Aunt Diana, wasn't that a new diamond bracelet you were showing off at Thanksgiving? The dominoes started falling. More family members chimed in. Others messaged me privately, asking for the real story. And then my phone rang. Aunt Patty. Her voice was different now, lower, almost ashamed. Natasha, I had no idea about your surgery, she admitted. They told me you were just being dramatic about a routine checkup, that you were punishing them over nothing. I closed my eyes, taking in a slow, steady breath. Of course they did. Meanwhile, Jessica had fully taken my side. She'd seen firsthand how our parents operated. She helped me craft a single response to the email thread. No anger, no defense, just facts. I recently underwent emergency surgery with a significant risk of complications. My parents refused to watch my children during this time because they had concert tickets. I am now focusing on my recovery and caring for my twins without additional stress. And then, silence. The support that followed was overwhelming. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. My real family, the one I was building, began to take shape. Cousin Michael's wife started dropping off home-cooked meals, unprompted. A second cousin I barely knew offered to babysit the twins a few hours a week, for free. Chloe began spending weekends at my apartment, getting to know her niece and nephew while helping me recuperate. And then there was Rachel from the hospital. She connected me to a support group for young widowed parents. Their first meeting was over Zoom so I could join from home, and for the first time since Daniel died, I felt understood, not pitied, not judged, but truly deeply understood by people who had walked this same painful road. Meanwhile, my parents' financial situation was imploding. Turned out they hadn't just been living beyond their means, they had been banking on my money to fund their luxury lifestyle. And Chloe? She was the one who uncovered the truth. They took out a second mortgage last year to buy the boat. I nearly dropped my coffee. Wait, what? She sighed, rubbing her forehead. They assumed you'd keep covering the house payments indefinitely. I let that sink in. A second mortgage, on their only home, to buy a boat, all while guilt-tripping me into thinking they were struggling. They've been lying to everyone, Chloe admitted, shaking her head. They're not broke, Natasha. They're just overspent. And the kicker? They could fix it if they sold the boat, if they got rid of their vacation timeshare. But instead, they were texting, calling, begging me to bail them out. Every voicemail was more desperate than the last. But with each passing day, something in me shifted. Their grip on me was loosening. I wasn't the desperate one anymore. I wasn't the one begging for scraps of love and approval. I was building something new. A life based on real support, on mutual care, not obligation. Then, 1 month after my surgery, something big happened. Chloe called, her voice tight. Mom and Dad got a foreclosure notice. I blinked. What? They have 60 days to catch up on payments, or they'll lose the house. I ran a hand through my hair. What about their retirement savings? She let out a frustrated sigh. Mostly gone. They spent a chunk on the boat, and the rest on some investment Dad's golf buddy recommended. I closed my eyes. Let me guess. Yeah. Her voice was flat. They lost almost everything. I sat there silent, letting the information settle. I'm not saying you should help them, Natasha, Chloe added quickly. I just thought you should know. That night, my phone exploded with messages. They weren't even pretending to care anymore. Just begging. My mother's text said it all. We never thought you'd actually cut us off. We assumed you were just angry and would start sending money again after a week or two. My stomach turned. They never thought I meant it. Never believed I had boundaries. All those years, sacrificing for them, prioritizing their comfort over my own, and they had never respected me. Not as a daughter, not even as a person, just as a paycheck. Meanwhile, my own life was transforming. The support group had become my lifeline, connecting me with other parents who got it. Through them, I met Diana, a real estate agent whose husband had died of cancer 2 years earlier. She had a 3-year-old son and knew firsthand how brutal this journey was. Over coffee one afternoon, she looked at me thoughtfully. Have you considered selling your place? I frowned. I can barely handle daily life right now. Why would I sell? Because, she said simply, this apartment is too small for you and the twins. You could take the equity, move somewhere more affordable, get actual space, and better childcare options. I hadn't considered it before. But now, I was starting to see possibilities I never had before. I was even making extra income. The memorial website I'd designed for Daniel, people from the support group had started commissioning me to make sites for their lost loved ones. Word spread. Before I knew it, I had clients, a purpose beyond just surviving, and the difference between my life and my parents' collapse became clearer every day. Then, they showed up again, this time with a spreadsheet. We need $14,000 to catch up on the mortgage and avoid foreclosure. My father's usual authoritative tone was still there, but now, it was laced with something else. Desperation. I could have shut the door in their faces. I had every reason to. But instead, I stepped aside. Not out of obligation. Not because I owed them anything. But because, for once, I was curious. Curious to hear their perspective now that they were finally facing the consequences of their choices. I gestured for them to sit at my small dining table. What about selling the boat? My father sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. We'd take a loss. And the timeshare? My mother was quicker to respond. We've tried, but the market is terrible. Then she straightened, her voice sharpening. Besides, those are our retirement luxuries. I almost laughed. Luxuries. Luxuries they couldn't afford. You mean luxuries you could afford if I paid for them? I asked, arching an eyebrow. My father narrowed his eyes. It's the least you could do after everything we've done for you. I let that sit for a second. Then I leaned forward. What exactly have you done for me? Silence. The challenge hung in the air. Right then, Leo and Ava came toddling into the room, Leo clutching his favorite toy truck, Ava babbling happily to herself. My mother's face lit up instantly. There are our precious babies, she cooed, reaching out for Ava. Ava took one look at her, then turned and hid behind my legs. My voice was calm but firm. They don't know you. A flicker of something crossed my mother's face. Guilt? Regret? Or just frustration that their emotional leverage wasn't working. That's not fair, my father protested. We're busy people. I gave him a long look. Too busy for your only grandchildren. Too busy to help your own daughter through emergency surgery. But not too busy to ask for money. Another silence. And this time, they had nothing to say. My mother's face crumpled. Whether it was real emotion or calculated manipulation, I couldn't tell anymore. Her voice came out in a whisper. Without your help, we'll lose everything. I took a slow breath. Then I met her eyes. I lost my husband. My voice didn't shake. My children lost their father. I let that settle. Then I finished, calm and unwavering. We survived. You will too. 3 months later, my parents finally hit rock bottom. The house was gone, sold off to avoid foreclosure. Chloe kept me updated, though I kept my distance. They managed to find a modest condo, a far cry from the 4,000 square foot lakefront property they'd once flaunted. My father begrudgingly sold the boat, for a fraction of what he'd paid. The timeshare? Gone too. And yet, they still weren't taking responsibility. They're actually blaming you for their financial mess, Chloe told me during one of our weekly visits, telling everyone you abandoned them after promising lifelong support. I shook my head, amused. Let them talk. And I meant it. The truth had already spoken for itself. And the extended family? They saw right through it. Even my father's own sister, who had always taken his side, called me. "I had no idea what really happened, Natasha," she admitted. "I thought you just cut them off for no reason. But after hearing what they did during your surgery, I don't blame you at all." It was validating, sure. But at the same time, I didn't need their approval anymore, because while my parents' lives shrunk, mine was expanding. A fresh start. Diana, the real estate agent I met in the support group, helped me find the perfect place. A small but beautiful 3-bedroom house in a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood. The best part? The mortgage payment was actually lower than my old rent. And for the first time in their lives, the twins had a backyard. A real backyard. With space to run, to play, to be kids. Meanwhile, my memorial website business had taken off. It started as something small, just a way to honor Daniel. But people kept referring me. Word spread. And before I knew it, I was making enough to reduce my regular graphic design clients and focus on something that actually felt meaningful. Sophie still helped with childcare 3 days a week, but I'd adjusted my schedule to maximize time with Leo and Ava. Most importantly, I had a community now. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles when we moved in. The support group organized playdates for the kids. Chloe had gone from being a distant sibling to someone I actually trusted. Even Rachel, the nurse from the hospital, came by with her kids sometimes. For the first time in forever, my life wasn't just about surviving. I was thriving. And as for my parents, they were still waiting for me to come back. Still expecting me to swoop in and save them. But I wouldn't. I had already saved someone far more important, myself. I had lost my husband and cut ties with my parents, yet somehow I felt less alone than ever before. 6 months after my surgery, I received a letter, an actual handwritten letter from my mother. My first instinct was to throw it away, but curiosity won out. Inside was something I never expected, a genuine apology. "I've had time to reflect on my behavior," she wrote. "Watching you build a life without our help has forced me to confront some painful truths about myself as a mother. I was jealous of your independence, your resilience. I resented that you didn't seem to need me the way I needed my own mother. But now I see that you did need me, just not in the ways I wanted to be needed. When you asked us to care for the twins during your surgery, you were reaching out and we failed you completely. I'm deeply sorry." The letter went on, explaining how they had completely restructured their finances. My father had taken a part-time job at a local hardware store. They had sold most of their luxury items and were living modestly for the first time in decades. She didn't ask for money or even forgiveness, just acknowledgement of her apology. I showed the letter to Chloe, who was skeptical. "They've been talking about writing to you for weeks," she admitted. "Dad was against it at first, but I think he's starting to see things differently too, especially after his heart scare last month." I frowned. "Heart scare? Just high blood pressure and chest pains, but it scared him. He's on medication now and actually following doctor's orders," Chloe explained. "I think facing mortality has humbled him a bit." I wasn't ready to respond to the letter immediately. I needed time to process my feelings. Was this genuine remorse or another manipulation tactic? Had they truly changed, or were they simply adapting their strategy? That night, for the first time since cutting ties, I looked through old family photos. Behind the smiling faces, I saw patterns I had been blind to before. My parents had always been performers, playing the role of perfect parents while serving their own needs first. 1 year later, a full year after my surgery, I finally agreed to meet my parents at a neutral location, a quiet cafe near my new home. When they arrived, I barely recognized them. My father seemed smaller somehow, his once confident posture replaced by something humbler. My mother's designer wardrobe had been swapped for simple, practical clothing. The twins were with Chloe for the afternoon. I wasn't ready for a full family reunion just yet. We sat in awkward silence until my father did something unprecedented. He cried. "I've been a terrible father," he admitted, his voice breaking. "And an even worse grandfather. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I see it now. How selfish we've been." My mother reached across the table, not quite touching my hand but gesturing toward it. "We've spent months in family therapy," she said quietly. "It was Chloe's idea. We resisted at first, but it's been transformative." I didn't rush to forgive them. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. Instead, I showed them pictures of the twins. I told them about our life. And for the first time, they just listened. They didn't interrupt. They didn't make it about themselves. As we stood to leave, my father hesitated. Would it be possible, someday, to know our grandchildren? I considered my response carefully. That depends on your actions, not your words, I said. If you're genuinely committed to change, we can start with short, supervised visits. But understand this. My children will only have relationships with people who respect their mother. Walking away from that meeting, I felt neither the crushing weight of obligation nor the burning resentment that had defined our relationship for so long. Instead, I felt something new. The calm assurance of a woman who knew her worth. A woman who had created boundaries and would enforce them without apology. Whether my parents could truly change remained to be seen, but I had already transformed, no longer a daughter desperate for approval, but a mother fierce in her protection and clear in her expectations.